welcome to Unmuted. It's a podcast about all things HR talent and HR tech. I'm Jeff Waldman, the founder of Scale HR and the podcast host. It's great to be back and to bring this podcast back. Obviously, we've been dropping many episodes over the past few months. This podcast lives on the website at GoScaleHR as well as our YouTube channel. And so I know that people have been hitting the subscribe button, so please keep doing that so you can get notified when new podcast episodes are dropped, and also other videos as well. And so this is a really good topic. And before we bring in our guest, the last couple of months have been focused on diversity, equity, inclusion. And so this topic is uncovering unseen talent, navigating bias in recruitment. Obviously, it's a very, very top of mind topic that's been so for the last several years. And then now we bring in the explosion of technology, particularly generative AI, which is sort of hitting our workflows hard right now. And so that is becoming a major issue. And so we did some research, and obviously there's an interesting study done by Yale that found that male and female scientists both were trained in objective hiring, but they were still more likely to hire men, and they consider them more competent than women and pay them more per year than women. So it's really interesting that this still happens, and obviously it's a major issue still. And then there's some other interesting stats, on this topic too, that white-sounding names receive 50% more job interview requests than black-sounding names. Figure for Chinese-sounding names, Pakistani and Indian-sounding names is about 28%. So that's a huge, huge startling fact right there that even, this day, this sort of unconscious bias is still rampant in our hiring practices. And then just another sort of tidbit from Malcolm Gladwell in his book, Blink, which I read about 5 times. He uncovered that only 14% of men globally are over 6 feet tall, yet 58% of Fortune 500 companies are over 6 feet tall. So you've got this disproportionate percentage of their Fortune 500 companies that are led by men that are over 6 feet tall. So, I'm not 6 feet tall, so I wouldn't qualify. So anyway, but we can go on and, cite thousands of examples of bias in hiring, but we're going to stop here and just welcome our guest here to the show. There's a lot to talk about here, and I do want to welcome our guest, Dimitropoulou. She's had a really interesting career at the intersection of HR and marketing, and she's going to help break all of this down and sort of dive into the world of unseen talent, navigating bias in recruitment. So welcome to Unmuted.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast and have the opportunity to talk about something that I'm really passionate about.
Fantastic. It's been a while since we first organized this and sort of scheduled this, and so I'm glad that it's finally happening. And so I'm sitting in the freezing tundra cold of Canada where it's snowing and I'm shoveling snow, and you are in the beautiful place of Athens, Greece, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Nice. I'm so jealous. But anyway, you're there for work, obviously. Well, and pleasure. Before we dive into this topic, can you just give us an overview of what you do in your work?
Absolutely. Yes. So I've essentially spent almost 14 years now working both in HR and marketing roles. And primarily, most of my career was working within the tech industry in the Kitchener-Waterloo and Toronto region in Canada. But for the past year or so, I've kind of transitioned to take on more of a consulting approach and really just focus on having more of a work-life balance, to be honest, and obviously being temporarily in Athens, Greece has really helped to be able to maximize, my time here, but also still work with clients in Canada and in the United States as well, whether it's to help them with career services or helping set up HR teams, or on the marketing side, really help entrepreneurs with brand awareness, email marketing, social media, so on and so forth. And this year especially, it has been very exciting for me because I've had more opportunities to also help with some more mentoring initiatives that I also feel really strongly about. So I'm a mentor with ADP List and have worked with a lot of individuals from around the world from different mentoring opportunities, whether it's like HR related or marketing related. And then also I've had the opportunity since 2022 actually have been a mentor with this incredible Canadian organization called Wave Makers, where I've been able to mentor young students through their virtual campus. So it's been a very rewarding and exciting past year for sure. And Yeah, really happy again to be able to speak on some of the things I've had a chance to work on even this year and before that on this podcast with you.
Perfect. And so obviously you, a perfect example of, someone that sort of, taking advantage of the virtual workplace in terms
Yes.
of leveraging technology. Obviously you can be in Greece, you can be in Canada, you can be anywhere really. And that's really, really cool. And so, it's really, quite astonishing still that you can have these conversations with people from all four corners of the globe, which is great. So, all right. So let's get to the fun stuff. Not to say that your career background isn't fun. What is? I mean, you can go to Google and you can Google it, and there's like a million hits on it. But
Yeah.
what is your definition of recruitment bias?
Sure. So, yes, to your point, a lot of definitions, but I think collectively we can all agree that, and my personal belief is that it really comes down to when a hiring manager essentially allows their unfair beliefs, or if they have any like unfair practices to really essentially hinder the hiring of a candidate. And what I mean by that is they allow their beliefs to then paint a negative image of a candidate and either exclude the candidate from the opportunity or just cut the interview process short for that individual. And some of the beliefs are based on personal characteristics of the candidate, such as their race, their disability status, their age, and all of which are things that don't have anything to do with their ability to perform the job.
I mean, it's a very complicated issue. I mean,
Yes, absolutely.
It's not straightforward, and I think it would be safe to say that if we had a fix for it, we would have fixed it by now, obviously, because we've been tackling this issue for some time, and I think it's only gotten more and more difficult. But yeah. So the next question is really around, as you mentioned about bias. It's a huge issue. It's very complex. What are some of the common types of bias that candidates may encounter during the actual hiring process? I know there's many. What are some of the more common types?
For sure. So there's about seven kind of biases that we like to hone in on when it comes to, hiring managers allowing those biases to affect the hiring decision. And there's things where there's like the halo effect, for example, and then the horn effect. So the halo effect is when a hiring manager is really impressed by one thing or maybe two things that the candidate has expressed or worked on in the past, that they completely disregard all the other kind of red flags, if you will. On the flip side, the horn effect is when, like a hiring manager sees one thing that they don't really agree with or they don't like from the candidate, and then they completely disregard all the positive things they've done, right? Or all the green check marks, if you will, when it comes to hiring for that position. Then, of course, there is the stereotype bias, right? Which is when the candidate, even on their side, is worried about if they're part of a minority group, especially, they're worried about the hiring manager having that bias towards them just because they're part of a minority group. Then there's also the confirmation bias, which is a bias where the hiring manager really looks at, they want to see what they want to see. So they'll listen for things that confirm their beliefs of that candidate. So again, it could be confirmation bias, could be a positive thing or a negative thing, depending on what the hiring manager has come to, whatever they've come up with the idea and bias for that candidate without really knowing them. And then there is affinity bias, which essentially is a bias where the hiring manager will find something in common, right? Or perhaps they went to the same university as the candidate, right? Or they are from the same town. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is great. Like we have something in common. And right away, this is now a positive interaction. And finally, we have implicit and explicit bias. So implicit bias is when a hiring manager has no idea that they're actually being biased towards the candidate. So it's very much like unconscious. So their hiring decision is impacted by unconscious biases. Whereas on the flip side, we have explicit bias, which is when, unfortunately, the hiring manager very much knows that they're being biased and discriminatory against the candidate, and yet they're proceeding on that path. Full disclosure, thankfully, I haven't encountered explicit bias. It's been extremely minimal where I have in my career, but for the most part, I would say that it does tend to be more implicit bias, at least from my personal experience.
So that's a lot.
Yes.
And, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, it's a very complicated situation.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'll give you an example of from my own personal story, which is actually on the flip side. So I was a candidate and I actually leveraged my affinity bias to my advantage years ago. And so what it was so growing up, I was a sports, and I played a lot of different sports, and I was also a volunteer with the BC Lion football team. So
Okay.
in Vancouver. And so when I was, so looking for my first job out of business school, I actually met with a corporate recruiter who was also a part-time scout for the Saskatchewan Roughriders football team.
Oh,
So
okay.
we ended up talking football for 2 hours. Nothing to do with HR, nothing to do with my experience, but the fact that I found something to hang my hat on, that's a classic example of affinity bias. He
Yeah.
hired me, because of our connection to a football. And I knew that, right? But I'm just saying, it does happen, and it's as a candidate, I mean, I used it, but on the hiring side of it, that was a classic, clear case of bias right there.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. So obviously, this is a very complex problem. So, and I don't really anticipate that we're going to be able to solve the problem, today. But what
Unfortunately.
can we do to deal with bias in our hiring processes? I mean, is there a place where we can start?
Absolutely. So there are honestly, that's the one positive thing. There's many things we can do. Like I can think of at least 10 examples. I won't go
Yeah.
through all of them today, but number one is honestly starting with raising awareness. Just being very mindful, like as whoever is in charge of, typically comes from the HR department. They will, be in charge of the recruiting process and talent acquisition process within an organization. So it has to start from those individuals to really raise awareness within the company and talk to hiring managers and express to them, listen, or whoever's sitting in that room to interview, right? Because it could be other team members as well. So the responsibility and onus is on every single person that's sitting in that interview room to really be mindful that this exists. There's, I mentioned 7 types of bias. There's obviously even more, but those are the more common ones. So there has to be that awareness and understanding that this exists. And then it's up to everyone to take that responsibility and say, I'm going to learn about this and I'm going to do my very best to not allow these biases to impact the hiring decision, right? Other things other than raising awareness when it comes to even how job descriptions are written and how they're presented externally, that has a huge impact on who even applies for the role. So being mindful, like there are tools out there, and I've used them myself as well, where when it comes to writing a job description, looking at, okay, how can we eliminate certain words that are maybe more geared towards a masculine audience, or how can we be mindful of how we're even wording the job description so that it doesn't just speak to the abilities of one group of people, right, while excluding others, when that shouldn't be the case and it should be open for all. So even with that, like I do really want to encourage organizations to look closely at their job descriptions and what they're posting out there, because that right there can even hinder who applies for the role to begin with, and they don't even know it, right? That's a example of implicit bias where they don't even realize it. Something else as well, simple to do in-house: standardize your hiring process. There's no excuse to not have a standard hiring process where it comes to, okay, we're doing A, B, C, D. This is the step. These are the steps that we're taking. This is what it's going to look like for every candidate, if you can, for every position, right? For the most part, that is possible. And really make sure that the assessments are being used to assess each candidate in a way that it minimizes bias as well. There's also things like blind recruitment, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well, because technology can play a role in that, where it comes to blind recruitment, meaning we eliminate things like the name or any other identifiers that could impact someone's or hiring manager's recruiting process and the hiring decision made because of their name, right? I myself have been in that position. Obviously, Dimitropoulou is quite a mouthful. So I can't tell you an interview that I've been a part of where I haven't been asked at least one time, right? Like, how do you pronounce your name? Or, oh, where are you from? Right? So it's one of those things where blind recruitment really can help us in the long run, because it can help us obviously eliminate bias even when it comes to gender hiring, right? Based on that, for example. Another example is using structured interviews. That's something that I also really believe in. So when it comes to, like I said before, having a standardized hiring process, there's also the other component of having a structured interview. So what that means is having a set list of questions that you ask every single candidate. And, in an ideal world, you would do that 100% of the time. You can't. So realistically, what I recommend is look to have at least 85 to 90% of your questions being standardized and asked in the same tone, in the same sequence to all your candidates, so that everyone has the opportunity to answer. And then leave some wiggle room, of course, for a couple extra questions that might come up, because maybe you want to dive in a little bit deeper on someone's area of expertise, or anything, maybe that they've accomplished even as a hobby, right? Or a certification, or anything that's maybe a bit more personal that you want to find out more about. Then I would say another step, or the sixth step, would be set clear goals for DEIB. Be mindful of them as an organization. Don't just say we're an equal opportunity employer and then you do nothing about it, right? Because I see that as well. A lot of companies, they kind of slap that on to the end of the job description. And then once you dig a little deeper, you kind of start to think, wait a second, where is this? What are your goals? What are your diversity inclusion goals? Where is the sense of belonging? What does your company culture look like? So really being mindful of, don't just say that you're an equal opportunity employer and you have DIB goals. Actually have them and communicate them to your whole organization. Oh, sorry, I think you're muted.
Yes.
There you go. You're good now.
The walk the talk, basically,
Yeah,
instead
exactly.
of just, just talking about it, they actually do it. Yeah.
Exactly. And then the final step, I would say, honestly, seek external expertise. So for one of my roles a couple of years ago, where I was director of HR for a tech company in Kitchener, one of the things, because I went in and I created a structured process, having structured interview questions, so on, and setting DIB goals and so on and so forth. And, I thought it was important for someone to actually validate my efforts too. Yes, I can do the research. Yes, I can talk to the professionals, but it's good to have somebody actually, for a third party that has, no bias, nothing to gain from doing this, really look at your overall process. So I was very fortunate to have an opportunity to have the entire talent acquisition process being reviewed by a team from the University of Wilfrid Laurier that was led by an HR expert. And he was able, with his team, they looked through everything and then they gave us some pointers and said, hey, Dimitra, like maybe consider this, or hey, can you explain this a bit further? Like, how does that help? And that was incredible, because I got really good feedback on, hey, there's some things I have to tweak still to really get it as good as it can possibly get. It's never going to be perfect, right? But truly it's an ongoing effort. You really have to make sure that you're being mindful and very, I would say, even intentional in that process. And don't just also focus just on gender or race. There's so many other biases that we have to be mindful of, right? Like, and that's where it can get frustrating. It's not just about just a couple things. There's a lot of things that we have to really take into account. So again, it's an ongoing effort to create a fair and equitable kind of hiring process and even work environment beyond that, essentially.
So this is absolutely, fantastic. Excuse me. And I really like to point about, seeking sort of outside help, because, I can't tell you how many organizations, that I've spoken to or, worked with that, they tend to go at it from but we can do the research and sort of figure it out. And I'm like, that's fine. But this is a very complicated area, and it's impossible for, HR to have expertise in every possible part of, HR. It's, virtually impossible. So I think it's a worthwhile investment if you, spend the money up front to make sure that what you're doing is, equitable and, obviously inclusive. And, I wanted to ask you a follow-on question about the standardization of the process. Obviously, with myself being, hard of hearing, and so it's important for people with disabilities, obviously, to have that flexibility, because sometimes they can't always do everything that an organization wants you to do as part of the hiring process. So what's your sort of take on that?
That's a great point. So I think in part of what we're seeing is, when even going back to my comment about having that statement of being an equal opportunity employer, right? There's always that little tidbit as well underneath that talks about if you need any accommodations, let us know.
Yeah.
But even with that, I find that, I'll be very honest, I've worked for organizations where we said that and there was nothing actually being done about it. Right. Again, it's going back to don't just slap it on at the end of a job description. You really have to mean it. You really have to give people a fair opportunity instead of just trying to scramble along in case somebody needs an accommodation, right? Because I've also seen that happen firsthand, which is unfortunate because then it kind of shows that you're not taking this seriously. So I would say in terms of having a more standardized hiring process is even when it comes to building that, being mindful of, okay, if we're setting, one thing that's become very popular the past few years especially has been having assessments that you're asking candidates to complete, or like case studies or a programming challenge, right, regardless or depending who you're trying to hire. And it's looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, so we want to create a hiring experience that's standardized but also accessible to all. So even being mindful of things, for example, you're trying to hire an engineer and you want them to complete a coding challenge. Well, ideally, sure, you would be doing it on video, watching them as they work. But even something as simple as that, saying, hey, you know what? This should take about, let's say, for example, 2 hours. The hiring manager know this. They've gone through the exercise themselves. They've tested it with other team members. So there's a general consensus it should take 2 hours. Give the candidate that task or that assessment and let them work on it on their own, and then submit the information and then submit, the solution or show their work, obviously, right? Because it's an assessment, so you need to know they can actually do it. But at the same time, it's even take away some of that pressure. Or if you're going through an interview where, for example, I believe in phone screens initially, right? So I don't want to do a video call with somebody right off the bat because I know that there's bias involved with that as soon as you see the person. Whereas voice only, we really help to eliminate a lot of the biases. But even that, looking at, okay, is that feasible? Is that something that makes sense for the candidate? And can they go through with that? And really be able to provide alternative solutions if that's not the case. But for me, I very much agree with even having a standardized process in the sense that you start off with a phone screen. So, you try to eliminate some biases there. Then you move on to a video call because then you can ask a couple, maybe a little more tougher questions, see how they react under pressure, right? Are they kind of checking their notes? Are they able to answer on the spot? Give them time if they need to answer, right? And kind of have those visual cues, which also help in order to allow the candidate that, time that they need to come up with the answer. And then eventually move into more of a group interview. So kind of even thinking of it from that perspective, do it step by step, right? Like, don't just go right from the beginning having a panel interview, right? Where you have, 3 people trying to interview one person. And because now all of a sudden you're introducing all these biases from 3 different people in the room, right? When it should be just one, and then kind of help move that process along and ease the candidate into a setting where realistically they'll have to be part of a team, right? So they'll have to meet the team members and better do that beforehand. But really, again, just being mindful of every step of the way. If someone requires accommodation, maybe they can't come into the office. No problem, right? That's when you turn to a video call, for example. Right. Or maybe they're a bit more shy. It could even be as simple as that. It's how do you help really ease them into the conversation and not just kind of throw everything at them and have a sink or swim situation. So again, just being really mindful of every step of the way and trying to create a standardized process that will really allow room for accommodation as needed.
The actual hiring process itself for the last 20, 30 years, I mean, obviously people like to go through the actual, interview process, right? And I mean, it's not the most accurate way, to actually assess people and their skill set and their fit to the organization. But we still do it because there has to be something, right? So, but I think the goal here is to have an open mindset, is to standardize absolutely, so we can better assess people, but to be open-minded so that if we have to make some tweaks along the way for certain people, then that's sort of allowed to happen, versus it being a very rigid process. So it's very interesting. So I just want to just sort of segue into technology, because obviously technology is a huge part of what we do every day. And so when it comes to, I guess, bias, hiring, inclusive hiring, all that kind of stuff, what do we need to be cognizant of when using tech?
For sure. Great question. And I think we're seeing more and more. Obviously, we're in the era of AI, right? Everyone's talking about it. I'm seeing it on both the HR side and the marketing side, where it's like, how can we use AI, right, to make our lives easier? And great news, we can. However, I there's the however part, right?
But there's the but coming.
Yes, there's a but. Exactly. So there's so many studies done on this, fortunately. Like, we're really starting to see big organizations like PwC, for example, or even LinkedIn, kind of doing a lot of case studies and really surveying professionals using AI and really understanding, and in various capacities, by the way, using AI in different capacities, and really understand the biases that come from that. One thing you have to remember, and it was one of the quotes in one of the PwC studies that I read, where it really talked about, people write the algorithms, right? And the people choose what data is being used. So that means, and how it's applied, right? So people write the algorithm, people choose how the data is used, and people choose how the data is applied. So what does that tell us? There's room for bias, right? So anything that has to do with artificial intelligence, there's a person behind it. And that means that program is going to have some bias based on who created it, right? And what their lens is and what their perspective and life experiences and expertise and so on and so forth are, right? So it's really important to remember that and say, yes, technology is an essential tool when it comes to hiring, but understand that even though such a useful, essential tool, and it can help to reduce bias. Like, there are ways to do that. It's not flawless, right? So you still have to be mindful, like, there can be bias. Even with that, like, I'll give you an example. When it comes to, we can use AI to help with blind recruitment, right? So that's one of the ways where maybe organizations can rely on certain AI platforms to really help them, like, automate the process of removing any information that can be helped or can be used to identify a person's ethnicity or age or gender or so on and so forth. AI can also really help us come up with structured interview questions, right? Yeah. And also be questions that are very neutral in the language being used, does not, favor one group of people over the other. And even with sourcing, right? We can use AI as a sourcing tool to really help us tap into bigger talent pools and more diverse talent pools overall, which is great. And I would say, so number one is that, right? So people are still writing the data and the algorithms, and they're just how it's being used. It can definitely help us reduce bias. And I just listed a couple ways how it can do that. But it's also important to keep checking the tool. Keep looking at what results are you getting, and then take the manual approach from time to time to really understand, am I getting all the resumes I'm supposed to be seeing in front of me? Am I, getting all the information I'm supposed to be getting? Is something being eliminated? I look for ways to identify some bias and work with a tool to further eliminate it. So the number two thing to be very mindful of when it comes to technology and hiring is that technology needs to work hand in hand with humans. Right. There are, we know this, right? Like, there's certain things that AI and technology just cannot assess, right? Not everything is a checkbox. Not everything is a statistical kind of factor that you look at. Okay, this person has 1, 2, 3, right? ABC, XYZ, whatever the case may be. It's really understanding that, again, going back to my previous point, you have to look and even validate the information you're getting and look at it yourself as a human being and really treat it as technology working hand in hand with humans. Because things like soft skills, which are incredibly important, that still is the job of a human being to assess when it comes to that. Or even looking at culture fit, right? Things like that, where you as the hiring manager know your company's culture better than any AI machine out there, right? So being able to identify things or express information to candidates to really share the company culture and then see, do they like what they hear, and how are they even responding to that? And I say this because there's also AI tools coming out that have been they're being utilized in different capacities now, but things for even facial recognition. Well, even with that, there's a lot of bias, right? So we don't want to use AI to manually look at a person's physical characteristics, because we're just a really long way from that not being biased, because again, it's people creating it, right? And those are some of the mishaps of, or even voice. Like you can use AI, for example, to give real life feedback on a candidate's interview. And while that's great, right? Because then somebody in the other room can be getting that feedback live and see what's going on. The problem is that the AI tool can, like their statistics again, it will misinterpret words being used by minority groups more so than words not being used by minority groups, right? So again, technology has to work hand in hand with humans. We have to understand there's limitations to AI and other technology tools, and keep checking to make sure that there's no biases that those tools are presenting when it comes to the entire hiring process.
Talked about the fact that software is built, the AI tools are built by people, and the really sort of interesting thing that I've done a lot of in the last little while is that when I'm meeting with a vendor, is I always ask them, like, what are you doing to make sure that your data sets are constantly evolving so that that they are inclusive and or at least getting more inclusive and sort of unbiased, because I don't think there's any way to eliminate bias totally.
Yeah.
But I think it's important just to hear what they're doing, because ultimately, if they're using like an old data set from 1995, obviously it's not going to work. And I'm not saying that they're doing that. I'm just saying that it's just sort of an extreme example. And the other thing too is that there are some tools out there that are now starting to leverage data sets that are culturally sensitive. So, for example, when you use the example of facial recognition, and so obviously when it first started coming out, it would exclude people based on sort of cultural nuances. So I'll give an example. Some cultures, it's actually rude to look up and actually look the person right in the eye.
Yeah.
And so it's actually respectful for them to look down at, towards elders. And so I question some of these facial recognition platforms that if someone is looking down in a North American context, how would it sort of assess that? And they said, you're absolutely correct. That person would be sort of assessed, negatively, because of that. So what they're trying to do is trying to incorporate, culturally sensitive. That's not easy to do, but it's better to try doing it than not. So, because technology is not going away. So,
absolutely. Well, it's the future, right? And we're going to see it more and more. But again, I think that's why it's so important to be aware of these things and raise awareness of the limitations, and really make sure that people understand that there are biases in technology, because again, it's coming from humans that are creating these technologies. And that's something to really be mindful of it, and even looking ahead and what types of tools that recruitment agencies use. And I know I've been talking to a lot of individuals I help when it comes to offering like career services. One of the top things, or even mentoring them, one of the top kind of fears that they have that I've noticed is that, oh no, there's an ATS system looking at my resume. How do I make my resume ATS friendly? And no one's going to see it. And I want to do it for the machine and whatnot, right? And they genuinely, there's a sense of fear and dare I say panic in a sense, right? Because they feel like a person's not going to see it. And I have to explain to them, that's not really the case. Like there's still a human being on the other side of it. We're not in a world yet where everything is completely automated and run by robots, obviously, right? And certainly there's very large corporations that do rely heavily on automation, of course, right? But at the end of the day, if you're applying for your local startup or even a small medium business, chances are they're not using a very comprehensive and costly ATS tool or AI tools, right? It's still going to be that human touch. And I think that's what we have to be mindful of, is even consider how will companies use the technology available, right? Not everyone's going to be able to spend the money to have these like really complex comprehensive AI-driven technology tools, there's people are still needed, right? So
Yeah.
I hope people
No,
can
absolutely.
find some comfort in that as well.
Is there a tool that you sort of come across that you absolutely love?
Honestly, ChatGPT is, I would say, kind of my, that's, I think, my most common one that I use, to be quite frank. And then when it comes to a lot of design, like with Canva, they have their own AI
Yeah,
as
they
well.
do.
And that's more of a design tool from like the marketing side. But typically, yeah, I tend to also, and I've tried, like Google's a bit and Bing as well. But I think even with that, there's bias, right? What tool do you use? So that's what I mean. Like, you have to be so careful about where you're getting your information from, who wrote it, right, or who created it, where is the data being pulled from, right, and looking at. And I know there's people now creating their own AI tools, which I think is very cool. Also a bit scary, because it means that we're going to keep getting flooded with AI tools out there, and then it's going to be a little bit harder, I think, over time to understand which one do you turn to. But at the same time, it's, it's interesting to see, again, people trying to utilize technology to make their lives easier. However, there still has to be an understanding that you can't replace humans in all capacities. It's just not going to happen. So
And that
again,
is actually
I
a really
hope
good
that
topic
gives.
for a
Yes.
podcast, actually. We can't replace humans. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, I just wanna emphasize, like, you can't replace humans, just to give people some hope. Not every, right?
I
Because
agree.
I see it too, even with a lot of LinkedIn groups, right? People are, a lot of professionals and even seasoned professionals, expressing concern over technology taking over
Yep.
their work. And at the end of the day, it should not be feared. It should be seen as a tool that can help you, not replace you, and something that can, should be welcomed, but with caution, right? Because there are limitations.
Absolutely. Our world is changing, and so is, the how we operate is
Mhm.
shifting. That's what it's really about. It's not going to come, that the robot, the aliens are not going to come to planet Earth and then sort of take over all of our jobs. So, all right, I just want to get to, and I have one more question for you. So, if our viewers can learn just one thing about what we talked about today, so what would that be?
Excellent question. So essentially, we have to really understand that it's not that reducing bias is a moral imperative thing we have to do. It's actually also a strategic advantage. So companies really need to, and HR professionals and organizations, they have to understand that being very mindful of reducing your hiring bias and just even setting DEIB goals. This is not just about being, ethical and morally correct. There is a huge strategic advantage, and there's
Yeah,
lots of studies out there that continue to show time and time again that by being mindful and creating a fair, inclusive environment, by having fair, inclusive hiring processes, and continue to be fueled by innovation and seeing what's out there and how you can improve, will literally impact your bottom line in a positive manner. And there's even some statistics too. I can pull. I had a couple written down. If you excuse me, I'll have a look here on my screen, just because I had a couple things that I think people might even be a bit shocked to hear. But from a couple LinkedIn studies that are, available online for everyone to read, there are statistics saying like 76 of employees and job seekers said that diversity is very important when considering job offers. So that's important to know, because you're talking about the job offer stage, right? It's not even about the beginning of the recruitment process, it's at the end.
yeah,
Diverse companies earn 2.5 higher cash flow per employee. That's a pretty big deal, if you ask me.
very good.
Inclusive teams can be over 35% more productive. Again, you have a lot of different perspective, a lot of different lenses coming into a conversation. You're going to be so much more creative than if everyone has come from the same, university, or the same school of thought, or the same
Right.
background. And all of a sudden that allows for that creativity and really standing out even among your competitors as an organization in what you're offering, but also even how you work internally, right? Even looking at organizational design and how can we be more effective, and how can we be more productive in our day-to-day tasks and projects and things that we work on. And the final one that I thought was very interesting as well, that came from a recent LinkedIn study, was that diverse teams make better decisions 87% of the time. again, these are pretty shocking statistics if you ask me, right? Like they're in being mindful of course, as you know, with any data that we consume, any studies that we look upon, you have to be mindful of the sample size. Absolutely, right? So take it with a grain of salt. However, I think at the end of the day, the point I want to make here is that, again, being mindful of having the reducing bias in hiring, having DIB initiatives and goals, it's not just something to do to be ethically or morally correct. It's also a strategic advantage for the organization at the end of the day. And it's I think as simple as that.
Love it. I think it's fantastic. I mean, I could go on, for the next 10 hours and talk to you about this, but we have to end here. But I just want to thank you for being here with me. It was a pleasure speaking to you.